While I mainly tackle Space Marine based conversions on this channel, it's not to say that other non-Space Marine kitbashers can't be just as simple or as rewarding. I hope to rectify the balance a little in this video as I finally take on some Xenos. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video I'll be tackling a member of the Scythes. The Scythes are a personal lich guard of the big man himself, Zarek, the Silent King. Being the personal bodyguard of such a high-ranking ruler means that they are above your rank-and-file lich guard. As such, I wanted to start off with a model that had a much greater stature than the regular lich guard. I chose the Royal Warden and began to remove all the components required to build him from the sprue. This gave me a model that was not only physically bigger but was also much more ornate, something that fitted its higher rank. With the components removed, I began the process of cleaning up the components, removing any mold lines or sprue tabs using my knife. Even though I was using the Royal Warden as the basis of the conversion, I wanted my Stellar Scythe to look different. Most of this would be done by changing out his arms. As such, the segmented cloak that hung from his back needed to be removed. This would normally reach towards the left arm holding the Gorse Blaster, but with a differently positioned arm, the cloak would look out of place. So to resolve this, I carefully clipped away the cloak from the torso before cleaning up the cut. To help the Stellar Scythe to stand out, I decided to equip him with the Hyperphase glaive carried by the Overlord from the Indomitus box set. Luckily for me, both the Warden and the Overlord are fairly cheaply priced on eBay, due to them being included in Indomitus and the new starter sets. This means that chopping up the two kits isn't prohibitively expensive. In order for the Stellar Scythe to be carrying the Overlord's glaive, he needs to be given the Overlord's left arm too. Unfortunately, this came pre-attached to part of the torso, which meant I needed to grab my saw and start cutting. My main focus here was to retain as much of the arm as possible, which meant I needed to cut into the torso, probably a little more than was necessary. Once the arm was freed from the torso, I started to trim the arm clean using the sharp blade of my scalpel. Now that the arm had been freed from the torso, I next began to assemble the Royal Warden, gluing together the parts that made up the legs and the torso. With the torso built, I was then able to properly work on attaching the weapon. The first step was to cut away the small tab from the bottom of the Hyperphase glaive. This tab would normally have been glued into one of the holes in the base, but as I was using a different torso, this tab would not have lined up. I used my clippers to cut away the protruding pleats of plastic before using my knife to flatten out the surface. With the arm carrying the glaive prepped, I could begin to attach it to the Royal Warden's torso. I started by attaching the spine to the back of the torso. This small round tab fitted perfectly without any adjustments being needed. Once this had been glued in, it gave me a rough idea of how the arm should be positioned and what tweaks needed to be made to it. I took the arm that had been removed from the Overlord's torso and tested the fit. This showed me that some cuts needed to first be made to the inside of the upper arm to allow it to fit snugly against the torso. I did this carefully with my knife, scraping away small amounts of plastic until the arm sat flush. In addition to this, I also needed to make some small tweaks to the forearm attached to the glaive. The angle of the arm was now slightly different, so in order for it to line up, I once again made a few cuts. Once everything was fitting together nicely, I glued the left arm into place between the glaive and the torso. With the weapon attached, I then glued everything to its base. I felt that the glaive was much more likely to get knocked and the joints damaged without this extra reinforcement. As I was planning on a more scenic base, this meant that I didn't have to worry about no longer being able to paint the model separately. While the Lich Guard are not always equipped with them, their dispersion shields are a very iconic part of their style. This loadout is perfect for a Stellar Scythe as it not only links back to its Lich Guard origins, but also helps to give the model some added bulk and therefore status. So I took one of the shields from the Lich Guard kit. The only problem here was that these are normally carried in the right arm. As such, the pre-sculpted arm was on the wrong side of the shield, and so it needed to be removed. I started off with my clippers and used this to remove the bulk of the hand. With this clipped away, I then started to use my knife to scrape away small amounts at a time, slowly carving out the remaining hand until it sat flush against the inside surface of the shield. I didn't worry too much about getting things perfect here either. The forearm will cover this area later on. With the shield prepped, I then needed an arm to carry it. I had initially considered the Lich Guard, but I wouldn't have had the hand. I did also consider using the Royal Warden's original right arm, after clipping away the Goresplaster of course. However, the angle would have been wrong too. Ultimately, I settled on using the Overlord's right arm. The positioning was perfect, but I did need to also clip this away from the torso. I started by using clippers to free the arm from the torso before removing any unneeded plastic and generally tidying things up using my knife. The Overlord's right arm couldn't be attached just yet. I needed the remaining part of his hand, which was still attached to the Tachyon arrow. The fingers were also cut with my clippers, and with these I tried to get as close to the point of the fingers during the Tachyon arrow with my cut in order to retain as much of them as possible. Once the fingers were cut away, I cleaned them up with my knife before gluing the fingers to the right hand. After allowing the fingers to dry, I could bring in the shield. As I did so, I could see that there were a few points that the hand didn't quite line up against the shield at. Therefore, I needed to widen the two struts that would have previously sat against the arm. With this done, I could glue the arm to the shield. Luckily, the shield, apart from the original hand, was otherwise symmetrical, so once the hand was removed and attached to the arm, it didn't look odd or like it was facing the wrong way. After giving the shield a chance to dry, I then went ahead and attached the arm to the torso. As I had mentioned earlier, I wanted to remove the segmented cape from the Royal Warden's back in order to help differentiate this model from other Wardens. However, I still wanted to be a little more ornateness to this model. So I took the small section of cape that was attached to the Royal Warden's arm and used my saw to separate the two pieces. The saw was particularly useful here as it allowed me to separate the horizontal rod from the forearm without damaging it. Once removed, I compared the length against the model. It was a little too long, so I clipped away the bottommost segments from each of the three strands, as well as making a few trims to the horizontal rod. Once everything was fitting nicely, I could glue the newly formed tassets to the pelvis. Finally, I just needed a head, and to keep things simple, whilst also remaining true to the souped-up Lichguard style, I opted to use one of the base Lichguard heads. This was glued to some of the protruding rods from the neck, and with that, the model was completed. All that was needed to do now was to base and paint it, which left me with this. And here we have the finished Stellar Scythe, painted in the colours of the Sarkhan dynasty, matching those of their liege, the Silent King. The base was painted to match the client's existing units. I started off with a textured paint that was base coated with Zandri dust. I washed this with Agrox Earthshade and then dry brushed Ushabti Bone. Finally, the lip was painted in some Zandri dust. So now that the model is painted, I feel I've been able to capture the inherent stylings of the Lichguard, whilst also making this guy stand out to match his elevated status. If you enjoyed the Xenos Kitbashing guide, please do let me know in the comments below, along with your suggestions for other non-Space Marine conversions you would like to see me tackle. So the final thing to say is a massive thank you to all of my supporters. Whether you support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, your help is what keeps this channel alive and is what allows me to build these conversions for you. If you would like to help me out, then you can check out the description below, and please do subscribe and leave this video a like if you enjoyed it. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.